Hi, my name is Suryanarayan Sudersanam and I am here with Darp Sonkesharia. We're going to be presenting virtualized congestion control and yeah, let's go ahead. Here are the topics that are going to be covered in this presentation. So let's begin. The motivation for this paper is basically the rise of hyperscale data centers has driven a huge growth of network communication. Now, these large data center companies both control, as in they control both ends of the internal connections. So they are now deploying new congestion algorithms, either published or proprietary, to reduce their latency and flow completion times to their traffic. But they don't realize the fact that multi-tenant data centers, in which many tenants lease and share a common physical infrastructure to run their virtual machine workloads, they have their own congestion control algorithms. So now the problem is that the multi-tenant data centers owners, that is as in the owners of these data centers, have to ensure that all the algorithms still play well together with the shared data center networks and have to meet with the SLA requirements. Now that we know that this is a problem, let's figure out ways in which we can make these congestion control algorithms work together. A few approaches come to mind. For instance, the multi-tenant data center owner can strictly divide the bandwidth among the tenants, giving each a fixed allocation. However, this prevents statistical sharing of unused bandwidth. Coming to the second one, modify all the data center switches and tweak the fairness rules between tenants as at each switch. For example, by implementing separate queues or applying different marketing thresholds within the same queue. Unfortunately, as the number of tenant algorithms increases, this approach becomes harder to deploy while still guaranteeing fairness. Coming to the third one, I think this paper is mostly inclined towards this approach, as this is what the paper is about. Instead of we adopting different approaches taking advantage of the fact that all traffic passes through the hypervisors is the main thing, and this is what the data center owner controls. What I mean by this is a translation layer in the hypervisor could ensure the whole data center uses could ensure that the whole data center uses a single best of breed congestion control algorithm, while giving the illusion to each of the virtual machine guests that it keeps using its own congestion algorithms. We coined this to be virtualized congestion control according to this paper, or VCC. A non-ECN TCP flow can get staffed when running alongside many ECN flows. Its virtual ECN augmentation with our VCC, that is the virtual congestion control translation layer, provides significant increased fairness. We can see this in the image that is going to be shown further. I'll be going over these points that we see, that is the different methods with which we can do it. So as you can see in this image, there is a guest virtual machine and a data center, and in between those we have the hypervisor, which consists of a virtual congestion control translation layer. So let's go over those points that we had earlier. It's that how the VCC translation layer provides the benefits for fairness. It modifies the TCP header fields of the sent packets to enable ECN support in the underlay. Secondly, upon receiving an ECN congestion notification, it decreases the receive window to make the overlay TCP guest sender reduce its space and behave as if it were ECN aware. Thirdly, it modifies the TCP header fields of the acknowledged packets to mask congestion notifications in the overlay. Fundamentally, they viewed their problem as an instance of a concept of what we denote as algorithmic virtualization. While resource virtualization is about sharing a common resource and making each guest believe that it keeps using the resource privately, Algorithmic virtualization is about implementing a common algorithm while making each guest believe that it keeps using its private algorithm. Now that we know this, this paper digs deeper into VCC, that is Virtual Congestion Control, with algorithmic virtualization. In this section, we look at several available TCP modification techniques, also called as hypervisor translation techniques, that may be used in our VCC architecture. The first one being write into guest memory. As we all know, modern virtualization techniques such as active memory introspection and industry products such as VMware, VMsafe enable the hypervisor to securely monitor a guest VM by having complete visibility over its raw memory state and write into this memory when needed. Therefore, the hypervisor could also directly modify the congestion control algorithm in the guest by writing the desired TCP parameters in the corresponding guest memory and registers. For example, assume we want to add a full modern congestion control stack to a lost guest VM. Then the hypervisor could inject code into the guest as if it were malware with unlimited memory access. Next up, we have read from guest memory. As above, the hypervisor may access the guest memory using a guest introspection. However, by avoiding memory writes, it also monitors the memory and does not need synchronization. For example, this white box solution makes the guest parameters transparent to the hypervisor translation layer. It could provide access to the congestion window without the need to maintain state to track it in the hypervisor. Next up, we have buffer packets. The hypervisor translation layer can buffer in-flight packets, example, to be able to resend them without informing the guest. For example, in order to solve TCP incast, it can be useful to reduce the retransmission timeout value RTO min, and VCC can buffer in flight packets and retransmit according to its own RTO min buffer, even when the guest OS does not support the desired value or does not support changing the RTO's min at all. Next up, we have buffer acknowledgements. The hypervisor can similarly buffer received acknowledgements. If an acknowledgement is piggybacked on data, the acknowledged sequence number is reduced and the remaining bytes to acknowledge are later sent to a pure acknowledgement. For example, the hypervisor can pace acknowledgements to make TCP less bursty. Duplicate acknowledgements. The hypervisor can duplicate and resend the last sent acknowledgement to force the guest to halve its congestion window. For example, in case of TCP incast, the hypervisor can force a fast retransmit by sending 3 duplicate acknowledgements. Next up, we have the throttle the receive window. The hypervisor can decrease the receive window to force the guest to have fewer outstanding packets, since the number of packets in the flight is upper bounded by the minimum of the congestion and the receive windows. For example, the hypervisor can implement ECN or DC TCP specifically upon explicit congestion notification. The hypervisor translation layer decreases the receive window that it sends to the guest without forwarding the explicit congestion notification itself. Last but not the least, this is like the main thing this paper concentrates on: modify the three-way handshake. The hypervisor can change the options that are negotiated when setting up the connection. The hypervisor, for example, the hypervisor can modify the negotiated MSS or enable timestamps. This technique is also needed for several of the above techniques. We will go ahead with modification of the three-way handshake in the next section. I would like to explain the next 2 slides based on this figure that we have over here. This figure illustrates how a combination of the three-way handshake modification and the receive window throttling technique can help provide virtual ECN benefits to non-ECN TCP traffic. Implementation of this technique will be later discussed in this presentation in the next section. But before we go ahead, let's get into what this is actually. VCC translation layer in the hypervisor first uses a three-way handshake modification technique. What it does is, in A, it modifies the TCP header fields of the sent packets to enable ECN support in the underlay. Next, while VCC only sets the ECT bit in the IP header of the outgoing data packets and forwards incoming acknowledgements transparently. As you can see in B, it uses the receive window throttling technique upon congestion. And in C, upon receiving an ECN congestion notification, it decreases the advertised receive window to force the overlay TCP guest sender to reduce its space and behave as if it were ECN aware. It also modifies the TCP header fields of the acknowledged packets to mask congestion notifications in the overlay. Note that we assume that the receiver either is ECN enabled or also has a VCC translation layer. We can just get past this and this slide, as we have already finished this in the figure that I explained. Apart from this assumption that I talked about earlier, we are going to be taking two more assumptions before we move ahead. Assume that all the processing and communication times within the guest and the hypervisor are negligible, and secondly, they build a TCP new Reno state machine that is based on RFC and RFC 6582, and assume that the guest follows the state machine. These assumptions are made, then two provable theorems are possible. Theorem 1. The translation layer can exactly emulate an ECN aware TCP new Reno protocol given a non-ECN TCP new Reno guest. Theorem 2. The translation layer can exactly emulate DC TCP given a non-ECN TCP new Reno guest. These proofs are important, but it's the insight that we get from these that is going to be more important when we go ahead in this section. The authors of this paper believe that we could generalize these theorems to more complex translations by concatenating simpler translations in the VCC translation layer. Example, we could translate TCP new Reno and ECN to DC TCP by concatenation. In A, we say that TCP new Reno with ECN to TCP new Reno without ECN. Simply modify the three-way handshake. And in B, we can do TCP new Reno without ECN to DC TCP as shown above. Now I would be giving the mantle to Darp.
Two experiments, one with VCC in two distinct environments. Here VCC represents virtual congestion control. For that they have used Ubuntu with 14.04, having Linux kernel 3.19 and 3.13, having links 1 Gbps with Minimint. The second one with the proof of concept in the VMware. The purpose of these experiments were to observe the unfairness of ECN and non-ECN flows and to understand the importance of it and why, in which environments it is happening. So what is ECN? ECN is explicit congestion notification. In this system, they reduce the number of packets when they detect the network congestions before any packets has been lost in the network. So they prevent the retransmitting of the packets by doing this. So they have used with how VCC to simulate the situation at present, and the following they conducted the experiments with that. So they have used 10 senders connected to a switch to a single receiver. All the senders were running on the Linux guest, having bandwidth of 100 Mbps. The delay is in 0.25 milliseconds. The RTT having 1 millisecond. They use the TCP new Reno as a congestion algorithm. They use the tool iPerf and T-Shark for capturing packets and measuring statistics for traffic source. This is the graph for the fairness, which depicts the fairness of the evolution of ECN and non-ECN flows. Here in the first one you can see that the non-ECN and ECN, when the non-ECN has a majority, there is not much effect for this. The second one is when they have equal size flows for in the network. You can see the small gap in between the network bandwidth allocation. The third one, when there is a majority of the flows are ECN flows and the non-ECN flows are very large. So here you can see the significant difference between the bandwidth allocation. So because of this, there is a low throughput in the non-ECN flows, and they have to suffer from the starvation. And because of that, they send the fewer packets to the receiver. Here is the same experiment with the higher bandwidth allocation, 1 Gbps bottleneck, and you can see the same observation as previous one. Now, how do we solve this? So here we observe that it is being biased when number of ECN flows are greater than number of non-ECN flows, because ECN flows has the equal distribution among themselves for the bandwidth, but not for the non-ECN ones. Only smaller number of non-ECN breaks the fairness of the network to the non-ECN flows. Here you see the ratio. When the ratio becomes very large, we see the bandwidth. We see the significant difference in the bandwidth allocation. Here, why did we focus on number of non-ECN flows as lesser? Because in the latest generation systems already have the ECN congestion system, but the legacy systems which are running through the decades, and they don't have the ECN implemented in themselves, so they do have to starve, face the starvation process. Now here is another chart depicting that what is the ECN has the largest impact, where the non-ECN flows are the lesser. Now, to discuss the second proof of concept they worked on is VMware. On VMware ECXI hypervisors vSwitch, which powered by Dell powered T610 server, having 12 GB RAM and 2 Intel Xeon processor at 2.4 GHz. They implemented a VCC translation layer to divide controlling preferred and unpreferred flows by controlling changing receiver's window space. That is called virtual ECN. By doing this, they have fine-grained bandwidth allocation by the VCC translation layer. We'll see. So this is the visual representation what I earlier explained, that here's the sender connected to the VCC translation layer, and that is connected to the network switch, and which is connected to the receiver. Here is the bandwidth of switch. Sender to switch has the bandwidth of 12 Mbps, and switch to receiver has a bandwidth of 10 Mbps. So what happens is, when sender has their own congestion control method, but when it reaches to VCC translation layer, the VCC translation layer monitors the packets passing through that, and if it detects there is a non-ECN flow, it modifies the packet in order to behave in ECN manner, and then it is later on sent to vSwitch and then switch to receiver, and the vice versa also. When VCC layer receives the packet from the receiver, it reverts it back to the sender's congestion method. In this way, it has implemented a virtual ECN flow without actual ECN. Here we can see the ECN benefits of total transmission throughput for 10 concurrent non-ECN flows sharing 10 Mbps link compared to the same experiment with 10 concurrent ECN flows and 10 concurrent virtual ECN flows. The non-ECN flows have 2.3% of the link capacity is wasted on the retransmission due to the packet drop in the congestion queue at the port connecting to the switch to the receiver. The virtual ECN, it lost capacity is regained as a virtual ECN can react to the congestion without dropping the packet and retransmitting them, which is exactly like the ECN behavior. As you can see in the figure, the ECN and virtual ECN has the same graph. Now the first graph represents the ECN versus non-ECN, where we can see the non-ECN is suffering. Here you can notice that the good put is only 14.2% of the average good put of ECN flows, and the fairness index is 0.921. In the same environment, they have conducted the experiment for ECN and now virtual ECN flow, and they have noticed that 103.8% of the average ECN flow could put for the virtual ECN flow, and they also noticed that the fairness index is 0.994. In the second experiment, they have mentioned the restriction of bandwidth usage as the packet monitored by the transport layer throughout the unpreferred drops due to receive window throttling, thus providing the preferred flows to a larger share of bandwidth. Total throughput before and after introduction of the preferred flows remains relatively constant, and that affects on the performance and the latency. Here VCC translation layer in the VMware that is called as a TV filter, and all this computation is done in Hypervision's own memory. This is the pattern for the congestion window. Here you can see that send time series for virtual ECN flow is modulating the receiver's window impact on the send window directly. So we can see that if you control the receiver send window, you can modulate the draw number of dropping in the packets, and you can control the flow. Here's the another representation where you can see that the 3 unpreferred and 2 preferred flows reaction. So this is when we use the receiver window throttling by VCC transmission layer, and you can see the sum of the window is the similar, so there is no bandwidth wastage while we use VCC translation layer. Now let's see some implementation obstacles and the benefits when we plan to implement VCC in real life. Architecturally, there is a Microsoft Hyper-V extensible switch extension, and VMware's ESXi DB filter, which I earlier mentioned, has an architecture for an independent module that can inspect, modify, and re-inject the packets. This is typically used by firewalls, security modules. So we can leverage this for the VCC translation layer implementation. Hypervisor delay. This is when we consider the processing delay for transmitting packets from non-ECN to ECN, which may affect the RTT and also have context switching delay. Hypervisor bypass. Virtualized work bypass to NIC, network interface card. High-end devices and the new operating system already have the latest ECN congestion system. So we can use the NIC to implement virtual congestion system in order to support the legacy systems. The TSO. TSO represents TCP segmentation offload and LRO represents a large receive offload. We can reduce the CPU overhead and increase the throughput of the network connections, because TSO processes the large packets to NIC and LRO does the reverse operation. Now the configuration, as we don't know which virtual operating system, which ports they will be using, which IP address they will have, and which applications they will use the congestion control mechanism. So it will be tricky to look out for. It will be tricky for the virtual congestion control transmission layer. Delay-based congestion control. Here we split the connections and buffer for the delay-based TCP connections. UDP. In the complete paper, they talked about similar to TCP. They talked about TCP connections. So here we assume that with the additional buffer and complexity, we can transmit also UDP, universal language. So to translate and congestion control algorithms, we would need time of n square translations by the translation layer. So what if we have universal atomic congestion control protocol, and that will, if we had that, then we would have only 2n O of 2n time complexity for converting it by the translation layer. We can use this system for encryption also, such as TCP encrypt IPsec to legacy, as the legacy system does not use any encryption, unencrypted TCP network. Now let's say debugging. More debugging, by using this we can have more complex packet processing at the endpoint, but normalizing it will simplify the network, as we have the less packet drops and we will save the processing time for retransmitting the existing packets.
In conclusion, their goal was to make it easy to develop new and improved congestion control algorithms with multi-tenant data centers without having to worry about TCP friendliness with non-participating virtual machines. In this paper, this paper presents VCC, which enables the data center owner to introduce a new congestion control algorithm in the hypervisor. Internally, the hypervisor translates between the new congestion control algorithm and the old legacy congestion control, allowing legacy applications to enjoy the benefits of the new algorithm. And thus they have, with the insight provided, proved that this is possible. Thank you.